Okay, thank you. And first of all, I would like to also on behalf of my co-authors, so James Zhang, Floor Rink and Dennis Veltrop, to thank the FAR for allowing us to present one of our papers within this project, and obviously also Esme for first of all, discussing some of the elements of the paper, and second, to moderate the discussion with the audience afterwards. But before I will go into details regarding today's project, I first would like to highlight a couple of things regarding the broader scope of our project. So as Jan already alluded to, this project or today's study is part of the multiple team membership idea. And what you see on this slide is basically the essence of MTMs and all, or being on multiple teams. And what you see here is, for instance, when you focus on the red figure, is that she sits currently on 3 audit teams. If you then compare her to the guy in purple, who sits on 2 teams, the green one and the orange one, you can imagine that this comes along with certain dimensions or dynamics. And if you still focus on the broader scope of our project, I think one key element to highlight is that if you look at MTMs or sitting on multiple teams, that you can see it as a double-edged sword. So basically, on the one hand, you have certain demands that come along with sitting on several teams, while on the other hand, you also have certain resources that you can get by sitting on more than one team at the same time. So first of all, very briefly on the demands, which is related to one of our prior projects. So if you then look at the demands, you can basically make a distinction between, on the one hand, task-related demands, and on the other, the social demands. So an example of a task-related demand is, for instance, that you as a team member have to switch between engagement A and engagement B, which requires, for instance, switching costs. So, for instance, you can imagine that while doing your job on one team, you have been involved in other types of audit tasks while serving on the other audit team. So this could be an example of task-related demands. And obviously, when you serve on too many of these teams at the same time, you frequently face a too high workload and also a lot of time pressure. Also, these MTMs may come with certain social demands. So, for instance, when you switch from team A to team B, the social dynamics within the group might be completely different, having to force you to change the way you work with your team members. So this also implies that you have to familiarize yourself with, okay, this is apparently my role within this team compared to what's going on in another team. And if you look at our first project, basically what we find is that if there are many MTMs on which you serve as an auditor, this likely will impair auditors' performance. In our case, we measured that in the form of quality-threatening behaviors. But what we also saw is that more resilient auditors, so auditors that are better equipped to deal with time pressures and also are better able to rebound from adverse situations, are better able to deal with such a situation. More importantly for today, however, is the idea that serving on several teams, several audit teams, also can be seen as a resource. And for instance, what you see in the literature, and here you can, for instance, look at the paper by O'Leary et al. In Academy of Management Review, what they emphasize is that by sitting on several teams, you actually build up a network comprising both information, experiences, and knowledge. And actually, this also helps your learning behavior, for instance, in terms of how to better or more efficiently perform your duties. And if you look then at today's project, Basically, we align with this idea and we try to associate how an auditor's network, so because he or she sits on several teams, may explain his or her compensation. And if you look at today's project in a nutshell, basically the main message of today's project is that if you as an auditor sit on several teams, within a year, but also at the same time, for instance, you can imagine that certain network structures are formed. So you meet, for instance, auditor one on one team, you also meet her on a second team, and perhaps the same is going on with another auditor. So you naturally see appear as a kind of network structure. And what is typical about these network structures, which is also highlighted in some of the literature on this topic or on social networks, is that these network structures actually facilitate interactions between the group members or between the team members on the one hand, and more importantly, perhaps from an audit perspective, is that it also stimulates knowledge sharing. And what we will see later on is that these network structures potentially might be especially important when you talk about so-called tacit knowledge. So knowledge that you cannot acquire from looking at, for instance, a checklist, so certain audit procedures, but more to tell you more about how audit work has to be conducted in practice. So much of the knowledge that is acquired experientially. And our basic assumption, or the thing that we are testing within this study, is basically that auditors, especially the less experienced ones, that have more ties, and especially when they are better embedded within the network, benefit from this structure, so from knowledge sharing, and actually show better performance, and via that way also will experience higher compensation on an annual basis. So that's basically our project in a nutshell. And if you look at our study, apart from linking it to social network ideas, which is basically emerging currently within the auditing literature, it also fits well with recent and current studies on auditor compensation. So, for instance, if you look at auditor compensation, what you typically see is that a lot of the studies, or the studies that have been published on this topic, which is still rare, but a lot of researchers would like to look into it because it's very important, obviously, is that most of these studies, they actually focus on partner compensation. And for instance, if you look at the Nechel et al. Study, which is, I believe, still one of the first, and which appeared in the Journal of Accounting Research, they use Swedish data and get their measure for partner compensation from tax filing. So that's very nice about the Swedish environment. And they find that partner compensation is, for instance, positively influenced by the size of the client portfolio, whether an auditor is specializing in certain industry, and it also depends on his or her revenue generation ability. Now, the other studies, so by Van der Houten, for instance, and Bianchi, they also look at audit partner compensation, and in the case of Bianchi, for instance, they use audit fee data. Now, if you then look at obviously other compensation elements or other compensation at other levels, there is only one study by Hoops, and the study is actually forthcoming in Review of Accounting Study, that does not focus on audit partner compensation, but rather focuses on the compensation of, let's say, the lower ranked auditors. And in their case, for instance, they find that rank is obviously an important variable explaining non-partner compensation, but also they focus on the US. that compensation of audit staff is linked to, for instance, the region or the cities where they live. Also with the idea that in New York, the cost of living is higher than, for instance, in many cities in Nebraska and Idaho. Now, if you then look at our study, so just like Hoopes et al., we focus on individual non-partner compensation. And yeah, what makes our study unique is that we actually have had access to individual auditor compensation from the personnel records of a certain Dutch audit firm. And on the other hand, we also look at the role of social networks in explaining differences in individual level auditors' compensation. And as such, we, I'm inclined to say, we also extend the recent studies on the use of social networks within auditing, for instance, and a very nice paper by Monica Cascioli and colleagues in accounting organizations and society. Now, what I can imagine, so hence a very brief introduction about social networks, is that some of you might not be totally familiar with what social networks mean in auditing. So here I'm not referring to the use of Facebook and so on, but I'm more looking, or we are more looking at how people form a network because they work with each other as they sit on different teams. And what you see here are a couple of quotes from a recent review by, I think, currently the expert on this topic within auditing, Bianchi, Causcioli, Minuti Mezza, and Sulkai. And what they basically do is provide a review of the use of social network theories and ideas within finance, accounting, and auditing. And I think if you particularly look at the second side, I think that nicely aligns with our idea. So basically, it tells you that the formation of social networks, for instance, because you work in teams, have the potential to affect economic outcomes. And if you typically look at current social network research in auditing, they tend to use or focus on what you call one node network. So basically, and on the, for me, the left-hand side of the screen, it means that researchers only focus on the direct and indirect links between, for instance, two auditors or between two audit engagements. And you also see it depicted in the figure on the right-hand side of the screen. And here you see, for instance, that node 6, so let's say it's auditor 6, is connected, for instance, to auditor 4, 7, 3, 10, and 5. And then you could say, so what you see here is basically the network that these members or these auditors form. But now let's focus on node 6. And basically what is unique in our setting is that we not only focus at the network that auditors form. So here you see that 6 has links, has ties with 7 and 5. But what is more important, and here you see also the idea of a two-mode network, is that if you look at 6, so which is in the middle of 11 and 13, if you have difficulties reading it, is basically that you see that 6 and 7 both serve on 2 of the same audit teams, 11 and 13, while 6 and 5 share memberships in audit teams via 13 and 12, if I'm correct, but it's bad. It's not really readable for me at this stage. Okay, and this actually also highlights 2 important features of social networks in auditing. And the first one is, and that is particularly highlighted in recent studies by Jasmijn Bol and colleagues, and also Monica Causcioli, is basically that audit quality, so also audit performance, depends on knowledge sharing. And the basic idea is that in order to do your work as an auditor well, you are dependent on the amount of knowledge that you can share or the amount of knowledge that you have access to. And just to give you an example, think of impairments. It can be very difficult to do these types of judgments. And in this case, I think it's crucial that as an audit team member, you have access to other auditors that, for instance, can help you or can provide you with advice about the judgments that you have to make in this area. And this idea, so knowledge sharing, is particularly important when you look at what you call tested audit knowledge. And this basically refers to the deeper understanding and routines within a certain field, and routines and understanding that are typically developed experientially. So because you work with others, because you share information, etc., etc. Another important element is what we call the duality of auditors and audit engagements. So apart from knowledge sharing, because you sit on several teams, you meet different individuals, and in most cases, the individual team members sitting on one team have one common goal. So for instance, you have to complete the audit before a certain deadline, and obviously with a minimum number of errors as possible. And also because you meet people within these teams and perhaps also on other teams, this develops trust among your colleagues and also especially among your team members. And if you then look at our paper, and this is something that the Bianchi et al. Review paper highlights, that it is important that you make clear with what stream within the social network theories you align. I think we align with ideas about capitalization. So basically the idea then is that because you have a certain network and a certain position in the network, you can derive certain benefit, but perhaps also potentially costs from it. And in our case, it's the compensation. And I think also when you look at this element, we see social networks as a representation of the network flow model, meaning that certain individuals in a network possess certain knowledge and they can stimulate coordination and cooperation. And basically our main hypothesis is that the greater the tacit knowledge transfer by a certain auditor, the higher his or her compensation. And what you see below is actually how we measure this in a nutshell. And what I will do next, very briefly, also in view of the time, is explain using rather simple examples what is the so-called local clustering coefficient, and then I will try to make it a bit more complex. And the key idea of local clustering is that you try to measure the embeddedness of a certain actor, an auditor, basically, within the network. And you can also see it as the density in his or her network. And here you see an example. So basically what we are focusing on is first, let's say, the person in the middle, in the yellow circle, and then second, the person in the left hand, lower hand corner. So let's say the guy with the tie. And so if you look at the first example, you see basically a star. And then in the second example, you see one extra line going from the guy in the tie to the lady behind the laptop. And then in this example, you see a better connected network. And what you do within, or what you measure with the local clustering coefficient is the extent to which the tie of, in the first case, the guy in yellow, are themselves connected. So if you look at The first example, basically what you see is that the ties, so the 4 people connected to the guy in the yellow circle, are not connected at all. So it gives you a local clustering coefficient of 0. The same applies to the guy with the tie, because he's only connected to one person, and so hence here you also see a local clustering coefficient of 0. And basically, the higher the local clustering coefficient, and it can range between 0 and 1, yeah, the better, the more embedded an individual is within the network. And if you then move to the example on the right-hand side, basically you see that if you focus on the guy in yellow, that there are 4 ties between the figures around him, and out of a maximum of 6, because basically what you can do is calculate the total number of ties that these 4 individuals can form, and that is 4 times 3 divided by 2, hence 6. And you see 4 connections. Now, obviously, you can add some complexity. So in this case, you can look at especially the bottom left-hand part. And here you see that the guy with the tie has some additional connections, which is in this case obviously not relevant for the guy in yellow. And hence, in his case, you see no changes. But if you then go again to the figure on the right-hand side, you see that out of a total possible connections of 6 times 5 divided by 2, so 15, you see 2 ties between the guy with the tie and the guy with the beard, and the guy with the tie and the lady behind her laptop, and hence you have 2 over 15. Now, what we do is a bit more complex. Basically, because now we have audit teams, A, B, and C, and D, and we have a certain number of individuals or team members. And just to give you a quick idea about what we are doing, this is the formula that we are using, which has been suggested by Opsaal. And here you see one typical 4-path centered on node 1. So the yellow person is exactly in the middle. And in total, you can see that there are 5. So also 3A, 1, BC, and then 7, sorry, B7. Now, the same you can do for the purple one, which goes via C. You also have 5 with 1 in the middle. And there is one more from 7B, 1C8, which is the green one. So you have in total 11 4-paths, and there is actually only one closed path, which you now see highlighted in red. So in this case, the local clustering coefficient is 1 over 11. Now, obviously, if you look at practice, it's much more complicated, but luckily we could make use of a package in R that makes these calculations for us. Now, then very briefly, something on the sample and research design. We got data from one audit firm in the Netherlands, and we got access to, in total, 365 individuals. And we could use also hours to use weight. And we include several controls like age, gender, obviously also rank, and several others. And we use different clustering coefficients. So there are different ways to measure it. And I think if you look at the main results, one key message stands out, which is that the more or the higher the local clustering coefficient, or otherwise stated, the more embedded an individual is in a network, the higher his or her compensation after controlling for instance, rank, age, tenure, and also whether an individual has obtained his or her CPA or RA degree. Now, we also did a couple of robustness checks. So, for instance, an alternative measure for clustering. I won't go over the details. We also checked whether centrality had an impact or yielded different results. It didn't. And also after including betweenness centrality, the results still held. We also did some additional analysis, and I think this is quite interesting because what we actually found is that the results were only significant for the senior samples. And if I remember correctly, there were 160 seniors in the sample. And perhaps also interestingly, what we also observe is that there is an interaction effect going on, basically telling us that especially what we call the on-site auditors, which involve the assistants, the seniors, and the managers, in case their local clustering coefficient is higher in combination with their level, they tend to benefit more from it, as is evident in the form of higher auditor compensation. Now, perhaps in view of the time, only the latter. What you obviously might doubt is, okay, but why should you expect that there is a direct relationship between clustering and compensation? So to deal with this command, we could, for a subset, in this case only focusing on senior managers, show that there is mediation going on from the local clustering, so your network, via better performance, so higher performance evaluations, resulting into higher compensation. Now, this brings me to the end of this presentation. So what do we think are our key contributions? Perhaps starting with the last one. So I think this study nicely adds to an emerging stream within the auditing literature, showing that individual auditor characteristics are associated with audit outcomes, and in our case, our outcome are compensation. Furthermore, we also add to the emerging use of social network analysis within auditing by showing that the embeddedness of the auditor in the network, so within the audit firm, has important implications, in our case, in the form of higher compensation. And similar to Kauscioli et al. And also Bianchi et al., we show that network structures matter. So we show that, or we infer that networks help to share knowledge within the team from which individual auditors actually seem to benefit. And last but certainly not least, we think that there are certain important practical implications. So what is important for audit firms and planners to realize is that putting people into certain teams, and hence the formal structure that then arise, has important implications for performance. And perhaps using also this element, I think when making these staffing decisions, what might be especially important is that audit firms should shy away from too strong specialization at lower levels. So while it may work out at partner level, our conclusions basically, or our findings, show that this might be detrimental to individual performance at lower levels. So you rather should put individuals in several diverse teams. And obviously, to the extent that this is not possible, I think it's fair that audit firms, when making decisions about promotion and bonuses, keep in mind that network structures, so formal structures, have important implications for this individual auditors, hence could imply that there are some dynamics going on which is beyond his or her control. And I think time is up, and thank you. And please, Esme, I think the floor is yours now.
Well, thank you very much, Reggy, for this very interesting introduction. There's already some questions in the chat, so don't be afraid that we, there's ample questions. But indeed, Esme, the floor is yours. Please.
Yes, well, thank you very much for this presentation and sharing this information with us. In your papers, you investigated the correlation between the auditor knowledge and the auditor's compensation, and also a paper about multiple team memberships. I mainly want to focus on those multiple team memberships for now, because you mentioned those expand the knowledge of the auditors the most. Because, well, they affect individual performance, and it also affects the audit quality, of course. You mentioned that the sharing of tested knowledge is really important for the high audit quality, and you mentioned in your paper that there's an inverted U-shaped relationship for that multiple team memberships. So I was wondering if there's like an optimum where we can determine how many multiple team memberships we should apply in practice.
Okay, thanks, and good question. I don't actually think we looked into this. So what is the optimal number? And perhaps what is also important to mention is that what our research also shows, so let's say the other paper, is that yeah, depending on how resilient an individual is, yeah, that this optimum might shift. So if you are very resilient, so let's say it's not the 100% true what I'm saying now, but if you are really well equipped with, for instance, dealing with stress, then you can expect that the optimum level is higher, so a greater number of serving on same teams on teams at the same time than when you are less resilient. But from the top of my head, we don't mention a particular number of teams.
Okay, thank you. I also had a question about your paper with the compensation, because you selected the sample from one audit firm.
Mm-hmm.
How is that representative for the whole population of audit firms? Because I would think it would be highly dependent on the audit firm you work for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, I think the audit firm that we got access to typically reflects most of the audit firms in the Netherlands. So I'm here a bit careful as not to disclose any identity, as you can imagine. But true, I think, so good point that you have some questions regarding the generalizability, because I think just like any other study, while this study may say something about the Dutch industry or what's going on in the Netherlands, more research on this is definitely needed outside the Netherlands, because then the dynamics can be different, and perhaps also how individuals are assigned to different engagements. So fair point.
Okay, so I have one other question. Mm-hmm. Did you see a difference in the compensation between male and female? Because I know that in the US there is gender inequality regarding the compensation people receive. Okay,
a good question, and that's one that I had a look at beforehand, because I not because you are a female, but are a woman, but no. So there is no difference. So that's very good news, I'm inclined to say. So there is no gender pay gap, at least in our research, visible at this audit firm, and I can imagine that, given that compensation tends to be relatively comparable across audit firms in the Netherlands, that it's quite similar also at other audit firms.
Okay.
So that's the good news.
So I think we move on to the questions in the chat. Mm-hmm. This one is from Chibba. High competent, well-performing auditors tend to be replanned by the partners or managers they work for, leading to a full planning within a potentially small cluster of people, but with high clustering coefficients. where auditors with less competence and lower performance are not replanned and have higher availability and could therefore be potentially planned on more diverse clients, connected to more people but with a lower clustering coefficient. To what extent might a clustering coefficient be a proxy for competence/performance?
Yeah, fair point. So we we have, thanks Chibbe, we have access to 1 year data, so we cannot fully rule out your your issue. But at the same time, I think it's also fair to say that if the clustering coefficient, so if is going on what you are saying, so that the clustering coefficient at some stage becomes really high, I think that at that stage performance will be hurt, because if you have to work on numerous teams, so a lot of teams, then I think you will face the negative effects of, for instance, multiple team memberships. But we cannot, then again, we cannot rule out your point completely, so thanks.
Okay. Then the next question is from Stephen. There must be some unstated assumptions about why member network belonging matters to audit quality. At the present, data seems to be more than a nice human resource management paper, but has to do little with audit concerns. Do you have data that will allow you to get these issues?
No, so we don't have information in this case, for instance, to the extent individual auditors engage in quality threatening behaviors. But what we are able to show is actually that clustering has an impact on evaluations, so performance evaluations, and what we got access to are both the individual ratings on jobs, but also the annual average or the annual overall assessment or evaluation. And I'm inclined to say that if your point is correct, then probably also if someone makes a lot of mistakes, this will show up in worse evaluations.
Okay. Then a question from Renske. Can it be that the coefficient doesn't measure knowledge or better performance, but instead social skills and how much a person is liked within a network, and that the compensation based on valuation is actually biased?
Again, we cannot, this is always one, let's say, drawback of archival research. And so we cannot fully rule out, but then again, in one of our sensitivity checks, we do make use of, let's say, survey data, which we have for part of the people for which we have the network data, in which we show that there is some effect on, for instance, whether or not working in several teams adds to a knowledge that someone has. I know this is only tentative evidence, but I hope that this takes away somewhat of the concern that you just expressed.
Thank you. The next question is from Chip again. Did you consider an analysis of the effect of network structure of audit teams on audit efficiency? You would expect that a high clustering coefficient for a team would correlate with higher efficiency, since mutual trust is probably higher, and supervising auditors have more feedback channels relating to the performance of the more junior auditors.
Ooh, okay. I hope that you are here on site, that we can discuss this point. So I don't know, Chibbe. Interesting point, but if you mean efficiency, whether this materializes into, for instance, a lower number of hours booked on an assignment, this might be possible, but again, we face one limitation in the sense that we only have data for 1 year. So, and I'm inclined to say that the idea that you are highlighting now will be more evidence probably in a next year, but perhaps we can talk about it later on.
Okay. The next question is from Andrew. He is wondering how you did build up the data for the MTM networks. He was wondering if it was maybe in the beginning, but he had slow internet connection because firm time and reporting systems may not give a complete picture because of incentives that may exist to underreport time spent on engagements.
Okay, so yeah, we got access to this data from the audit firm that we work with, and so for in total 80 teams, we got full information not only on the teams that were part of a survey, but also on the teams, on other teams. So a much broader overview. So in all honesty, I don't know to what extent our hourly data might be subject to underreporting, but we have more or less identical or similar results for using unweighted clustering. So in one of the analysis, we simply look at on what teams people sit and where they meet, and then we don't use weights, and we still find a positive effect. And we use a variety of weights based on these hours, and so I think this somewhat alleviates your concern.
Okay. In the practical implications, it was indicated that firms should shy away from specialization on the more junior levels, and instead should promote those multiple team memberships. However, is there already evidence on what teams you should assign the junior staff? Or for example, that the effect is stronger when assigning juniors across more different client industries or typologies?
No, so we didn't include this into our study, and I don't know of any study that did. So I know that most of the studies that look into auditor specialization, so at the individual level, they focus, I think, on partners. Sorry, can't help.
No worries. Then the last question for now. Have you also researched the impact of network structures between different ranks on tested knowledge? And is there a difference for colleagues who have more network structures with higher ranks or those who have more links with peers?
No, in this project, so we infer also from prior studies like Bianchi, so the only study that directly measures the impact of network structures on actual knowledge sharing is Kauscioli, but they have a sample of 43 auditors from the top of my head. So the basic idea that we test is that we assume that sitting or being more embedded in a network comes along with more knowledge sharing, but this is not something that we test directly in this paper.
Okay. Here's Stephen again. If I heard your response correctly, you have access to some of the detailed performance evaluation data rather than compensation as the DV. What about exploring those data for evidence more directly of audit quality improvement related issues in performance?
Then the question should be a bit more. It might be a nice suggestion, but again, so in one of our sensitivity or supplemental analysis, what we do is that we for 2 ranks, so for the seniors and the managers, so for assistants and for other groups, it was a bit difficult due to various reasons. We are able to show that higher clustering is associated with positive performance evaluations, which in turns probably can expect is associated with, positively associated with higher auditor compensation.
So then you assume that the evaluation is right. Correct.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day based on input from several people, I'm inclined to say. So yeah, so I would say that potential biases should average out, right?
Okay. And there's also a question, is there a ceiling for this effect? I assume they mention the effect of the networks. Where would it extremely high network backfire?
Yeah, very likely, because I think one of the points that Kaushali and colleagues emphasize or mention in their paper is that networks also, or being really embedded into a network, also comes with costs. So, and I think I very briefly mentioned it, is that it can come with information overload, for instance, and also too high coordination cost. And yeah, so likely there is some optimum, but we don't investigate this in our paper.
Okay. Those were the questions for now.
Okay, so
maybe I can have one more question. We still have some time,
Sure.
And you know, I love to discuss with you.
Good. Me too.
On the finance, because it's fascinating, I think. Because if you think of tacit knowledge, right? Tacit knowledge is better communicated between people who know each other somehow, right? So there's one thing is that you have people who know each other, and that makes it easier to communicate with each other. But you know, these people change team all the time. So I was wondering, you know, what makes this system work that you're looking at? Is it the fact that if people know each other, they will communicate good anyhow, so then it doesn't matter that much that they change teams all the time? But on the other hand, there's also a force which has to do with the audit process itself, which requires that the team members are very knowledgeable about the content of the audit itself, right? And then this fluctuation in team members is going to play in. So I guess my question is, what is the most important factor, and can you tease them out? So one is, you know, that team members just know each other well or not well, or is it, you know, the fact that we are looking at changes in teams that is going to impact the results that you find?
It's probably a good point. Thanks. It's probably the first. So if you know people well because you meet them at other teams as well, I think it's more easy that if you have a question, not necessarily related to the engagement that you share at that time, but on another engagement, is that you get more quick access and feel more comfortable asking a question to the other team member. So it's indeed what you say. It's a combination of trust and communication, I think. But the other point, we are not able to tease it out, because then I think you need a design similar to Kaushali, so that you can make a distinction between, for instance, what they did is whether the knowledge acquired or asked for related to was tacit knowledge or was more what they call explicit knowledge. So what can be included in databases and in checklists. So, but we can't do that, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
I saw another question in the chat. Did you analyze the way of performance evaluation on potential bias or noise? So is the noise or bias eliminated from the performance evaluation?
No. So we can't.
That's a clear answer.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So the audience, thank you for your very nice questions. Really helpful.